What would you do if a police officer pointed a gun at you in your own front yard? Not because of anything you did, but because of the color of your skin. Jonathan Carter, the head of the FBI investigation team, faced this very moment. But what the officer didn't know was that the man he tried to humiliate would become the catalyst for a movement that would shatter prejudices and transform an entire community. This isn't just a story about confrontation. It's about resilience, justice, and the power of change. The sun hung low over the suburban neighborhood, painting the white picket fences in a warm golden hue. Jonathan Carter leaned back on the porch of his new home, savoring the quiet moment. A fresh cup of coffee steamed in his hand, the aroma mingling with the scent of freshly cut grass. This was the peace he dreamed of. After years of leading high-stakes investigations for the FBI, it felt like a well-earned respite. The house was everything Jonathan had worked for: a spacious yard, a small garden ready for planting, and enough space to truly call home. Yet the neighborhood was not what he had hoped. As he moved in the day before, he'd noticed the wary glances. Neighbors walking their dogs had slowed their pace to stare, offering forced smiles or no acknowledgement at all. A few had crossed the street altogether. Jonathan didn't let it bother him. He'd dealt with worse during his career, but something about being judged in his own home stung a little more deeply. His thoughts were interrupted by the rumble of an approaching car engine. A white and blue patrol cruiser crawled into the driveway next door. Jonathan glanced up to see a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s step out of the vehicle. The man's uniform was pressed, his badge gleaming in the fading sunlight. Jonathan offered a polite nod, but instead of nodding back, the officer, Roy Anderson, lingered by his car, his piercing blue eyes fixed on Jonathan. There was something in Roy's gaze, an unwelcome mix of suspicion and disdain. After a moment, Roy shut the car door and strode across his yard, heading straight for Jonathan. His steps were slow but deliberate, and Jonathan could sense the confrontation before it even began. "Can I help you?" Jonathan asked, keeping his tone neutral as Roy stopped at the edge of his lawn. "You live here?" Roy's voice was gruff, more an accusation than a question. Jonathan straightened, setting his coffee down on the table beside him. "Yes, I moved in yesterday." Roy's eyes narrowed, scanning Jonathan from head to toe. "This house? You bought it?" "Yes," Jonathan replied evenly, suppressing the flicker of irritation rising within him. "Is there a problem?" Roy crossed his arms, leaning slightly forward as if trying to impose himself. "Just seems, unusual. This neighborhood's pretty quiet. We like to keep it that way." Jonathan didn't need the subtext spelled out. He'd heard it all before in different forms. This time, though, it was in the place he'd chosen to call home. "Well," Jonathan said, locking eyes with Roy, "I appreciate the concern, but I can assure you, I'll be no trouble." Roy's lips curled into a faint smirk, one that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll hold you to that." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back toward his house. Jonathan remained still, his fists clenched at his sides. He had worked his entire life to earn this home, this moment, and yet he already felt like he was trespassing. Watching Roy disappear into the house next door, Jonathan let out a long, controlled breath. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he muttered to himself, his voice tinged with both irony and resolve. The quiet street seemed less inviting now, but Jonathan wasn't one to back down. If Roy Anderson thought he could intimidate him, he was in for a surprise. This wasn't the first battle Jonathan had faced, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Jonathan stepped out of his house the next morning, ready for his routine jog. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that wakes you up with every breath. Birds chirped from nearby trees as he stretched on his porch, his thoughts wandering to the list of tasks waiting for him at work. He glanced toward the neighbor's house. Roy Anderson's police cruiser was still parked in the driveway. Jonathan exhaled, determined not to let yesterday's exchange linger. The jog was peaceful, but as Jonathan returned, sweat dripping down his temples, he noticed something unsettling. Roy stood on his front lawn, arms crossed, staring at Jonathan like he was a puzzle that needed solving. Jonathan kept his stride steady, offering a nod as he jogged past. But Roy didn't nod back. He just kept staring. Jonathan showered and settled in his home office to prepare for a video conference. As he reviewed case files, a loud knock at the front door interrupted his focus. When he opened it, Roy was standing there, now dressed in casual clothes but carrying the same air of authority. "Morning," Roy said, his voice clipped. "Morning," Jonathan replied, keeping his tone polite but guarded. "We need to talk," Roy said, stepping closer than necessary. Jonathan didn't move, his eyes narrowing. "About what?" Roy gestured broadly to the neighborhood. "This area has standards, certain expectations. I've been living here for 8 years, and we've worked hard to keep it a peaceful place. Jonathan tilted his head, his patience thinning. I'm not sure what you're implying, but I have no intention of disrupting anyone's peace. I moved here to enjoy it, just like you. Roy's jaw tightened. Let me be clear. This neighborhood isn't like the ones you might be used to. People around here value their privacy, their security. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else. Jonathan's calm demeanor faltered for a split second before he regained control. I don't know what you think you know about me, he said, his voice firm. But I earned this house just like everyone else here. If you have a problem with that, it's not my concern. Roy leaned closer, his voice dropping into a low threat. I'm just trying to help you understand how things work around here. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Jonathan crossed his arms, his sharp gaze locked onto Roy's. You're crossing a line, Officer Anderson. I suggest you step back before you say something you can't take back. Roy smirked, but it didn't hide the frustration simmering beneath his surface. Suit yourself, he said, turning abruptly. As he walked away, he called over his shoulder. Just don't say I didn't warn you. Jonathan closed the door, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. He was no stranger to hostility. His position at the FBI had exposed him to far worse. But this felt personal, like Roy was determined to make him feel unwelcome in the one place he should have felt safe. Hours later, Jonathan noticed Roy sitting in his cruiser, parked just slightly down the street. It was no coincidence. The man was watching him, testing him. Jonathan opened his laptop, pulling up footage from the security cameras installed around his property. There Roy was, lingering, pacing, staring at his house with a mix of suspicion and disdain. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just a nosy neighbor. This was a man abusing his badge, using his position as a weapon of intimidation. He picked up his phone and made a call to his colleague, Rick Daniels, the local police chief. Rick, we need to talk, Jonathan said, his voice steady but cold. That night, as Jonathan reviewed more footage, he made a decision. If Roy wanted to test him, he would rise to the challenge. Not with anger, but with the kind of measured resolve that had made him one of the FBI's most respected leaders. Roy Anderson had no idea who he was dealing with, but he would soon find out. The tension in the neighborhood simmered, unspoken but tangible. Jonathan had tried to ignore it, brushing off Roy's pointed stares and the growing unease that came with every encounter. But Roy didn't stop. If anything, he doubled down. Every day, Jonathan noticed the patrol car parked just close enough to remind him he was being watched. Sometimes it idled outside his house for hours, a silent threat with flashing lights just dim enough to not raise official complaints. It wasn't subtle, and Jonathan knew it wasn't meant to be. One afternoon, Jonathan returned from his morning run to find a notice pinned to his mailbox. The words "neighborhood security concerns" jumped out at him. It was unsigned but carried a clear undertone. People like him didn't belong. His jaw tightened as he crumpled the paper in his fist, his mind racing through possible responses. He wanted to confront Roy directly, but he knew better than to act out of anger. He had faced men like Roy before. They thrived on pushing others to the brink, waiting for a reaction they could use against them. Later that evening, as Jonathan reviewed case files in his home office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his neighbor Karen, who lived 2 houses down. The text was short but loaded. Hey, just wanted to let you know, Roy's been talking to some folks about you, saying you're trouble. Be careful. Jonathan read it twice, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Trouble? He was the one being targeted, the one enduring thinly veiled threats and harassment. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. He had built his career on keeping his cool, on playing the long game. If Roy wanted a reaction, he wasn't going to get it. Not yet. The following day, the situation reached a breaking point. Jonathan was trimming hedges in his front yard when Roy approached, this time in uniform. He walked with purpose, his hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. The gesture wasn't lost on Jonathan. Afternoon, Roy said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. Jonathan straightened, keeping his hands steady on the clippers. Afternoon, he replied, matching Roy's neutral tone. Roy glanced around, his gaze landing on the security cameras mounted on Jonathan's house. I've noticed you've got quite the setup here. Cameras everywhere. Planning on catching something? Jonathan tilted his head, meeting Roy's gaze with unflinching resolve. Just a precaution. You never know when someone might cross the line. Roy's jaw twitched. Lines get crossed when people don't follow the rules, he said, his voice dropping. And who decides the rules, Roy? Jonathan shot back, his voice calm but laced with steel. Roy smirked, stepping closer. In this neighborhood, I do. And I don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble. Jonathan took a slow breath, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He was done playing nice. Let me be clear, he said, his voice low but firm. I'm not an outsider. I'm your neighbor. I've followed every rule, every law, and I've done nothing to deserve your harassment. If you have a problem with me, that's your issue, not mine. For a moment, Roy didn't respond. His face hardened, his smirk fading into something colder, more menacing. You think you're untouchable, he muttered, his hand drifting closer to his holster. You don't know how things work around here. Jonathan took a step closer, his sharp eyes locking onto Roy's. I know exactly how things work, and I know exactly who you are. If you think you can intimidate me, you're wrong. I've dealt with men far more dangerous than you. The air between them crackled with tension. Neighbors peeked out from their windows, their curiosity piqued by the confrontation unfolding on the sidewalk. But neither man moved. It was a standoff, one that Jonathan refused to back down from. Finally, Roy let out a bitter laugh, stepping back. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. But guts won't save you when you step out of line. Jonathan didn't flinch. Neither will a badge when it's abused, he replied. Roy glared at him for a long moment before turning on his heel and walking away. Jonathan watched him go, his heart pounding, but his expression unreadable. He knew this wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. That night, as Jonathan reviewed footage from his security cameras, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let Roy's behavior slide. He pulled out his phone and began drafting an email to Rick Daniels, attaching clips of Roy's patrol car parked outside his house, his confrontational approach, and his veiled threats. This is more than a bad neighbor, Jonathan thought, his fingers typing quickly. This is a man abusing his power, and I've had enough. The tension from the previous day still hung in the air like a storm cloud. Jonathan Carter, calm and composed as always, stood in his living room, staring at the email drafts on his laptop. Attached were videos, undeniable proof of Roy Anderson's harassment. He had tried to give the man a chance to back off, but Roy wasn't the type to take a hint. Jonathan knew it was time to act. That afternoon, Jonathan made a call to Rick Daniels, the town's police chief and someone Jonathan had worked with briefly during a joint task force years ago. Rick was known for being no-nonsense, a stickler for the rules, and someone who valued integrity over loyalty to rogue officers. Jonathan's tone was direct. Rick, I need you to come over. There's an issue involving one of your officers, he said. Which officer? Rick's voice had a cautious edge. Roy Anderson, Jonathan replied. The pause on the other end of the line spoke volumes. I'll be there in an hour, Rick finally said. Meanwhile, across the street, Roy Anderson leaned back in his recliner, a cold beer in his hand. He felt untouchable. The black man who'd moved in next door didn't scare him. Not his sharp suits, not his calm demeanor, not even his veiled warnings. Roy believed his badge was his shield. As he scrolled through his phone, glancing at a local news story about a community leader challenging the police department's accountability, he chuckled. People like him always think they can change the system, he muttered. Not in my town. At exactly 3 p.m., a black sedan pulled up in front of Jonathan's house. Rick Daniels stepped out, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He approached Jonathan's door and was greeted with a firm handshake and a polite smile. Thanks for coming, Rick, Jonathan said, motioning him inside. Rick got straight to the point. You said it's about Roy. What's going on? Jonathan didn't waste time. He played the security footage. Rick watched as Roy's patrol car idled outside Jonathan's house for hours, as Roy approached Jonathan with his hand hovering near his holster, as veiled threats were exchanged. The final clip showed Roy angrily storming away after yet another tense confrontation. Rick's face darkened with each passing second. Damn it, Rick muttered. under his breath. "This is bad. Real bad." "It's more than bad, Rick," Jonathan said, his voice steady but pointed. "It's abuse of power. It's intimidation. And it's happening under your watch." Rick let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples. "Jonathan, you know I don't condone this behavior. Roy's always had issues, but I didn't realize it had gotten this far." "It's not just about Roy," Jonathan replied, leaning forward. "It's about what happens when people like him think they're above the law. You need to take action before this gets worse." As they talked, the sound of gravel crunching outside made them both turn toward the window. Roy had returned, his patrol car parked haphazardly in the driveway. He got out, looking smug as ever, but that smugness faltered when he saw Rick's sedan in front of Jonathan's house. Roy knocked on the door, his fist heavy against the wood. Jonathan opened it, his expression calm. "Something I can help you with, Roy?" Roy glanced over Jonathan's shoulder, spotting Rick sitting in the living room. His face tightened. "What's going on here?" "You tell me," Jonathan said, stepping aside to let Roy in. "It seems the police chief has a few questions for you." Rick stood, his posture commanding. "Anderson, sit down," he ordered. Roy hesitated, but eventually complied, his movements stiff. "What's this about, Chief?" Rick wasted no time. "It's about your conduct, Roy. I've seen the footage. Your behavior toward Mr. Carter is unacceptable. Harassment, intimidation, outright abuse of your position." Roy's face turned red. "I was just keeping an eye on the neighborhood. You can't trust everyone who moves in." "Stop," Rick interrupted, his voice like a whip. "Don't even try to justify this. Jonathan Carter is the head of the FBI's investigative team." Roy's mouth dropped open. "FBI," he stammered. Jonathan stepped forward, his sharp eyes locked on Roy. "That's right, and I've been recording every move you've made, every insult, every threat. It's all documented." Roy looked like a deer caught in headlights. "I didn't know." "That's the problem," Jonathan cut him off. "You didn't care who I was. You only saw what you wanted to see. A black man you thought you could intimidate, and now you're going to answer for it." Rick turned to Roy, his expression cold. "Anderson, you're suspended effective immediately. Hand over your badge and gun. There will be a full investigation." Roy hesitated, but the steel in Rick's voice left no room for argument. He handed over his badge and gun, his hands trembling. Jonathan watched in silence, his face unreadable. As Roy was escorted out of the house, the weight of what had just happened settled over the room. "Thank you, Rick," Jonathan said quietly. Rick nodded. "This isn't over yet, Jonathan, but I promise we'll get it right." The neighborhood buzzed with whispers the next morning. News spread fast, and by now everyone had heard about Roy Anderson's suspension. Some neighbors leaned against their fences, murmuring in hushed tones, while others scrolled through social media posts that detailed the entire confrontation. A few had even filmed snippets of Roy's disgraceful behavior, and now those clips were going viral. Jonathan Carter stood at his kitchen window, sipping a steaming mug of coffee. His face was calm, but his mind churned with thoughts of what had unfolded the day before. He had dealt with countless adversaries in his line of work, but this was different. This wasn't about breaking a case or catching a criminal. This was about setting an example, showing that no one, not even a police officer, was above the law. Outside, the hum of a news van pulling into the street broke the quiet. A reporter and her cameraman stepped out, their eyes scanning for Jonathan's house. A few moments later, his doorbell rang. Jonathan didn't move. He wasn't ready to give a statement yet. Instead, he let the cameras linger outside, capturing shots of his home and the quiet street. Down the block, Roy Anderson's house was a stark contrast. The blinds were drawn, and his patrol car, now parked in the driveway without its official insignia, seemed out of place. Inside, Roy paced back and forth, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. His phone buzzed with messages, most of them unsupportive. Even his colleagues had distanced themselves, refusing to return his calls. "You brought this on yourself," his wife muttered from the kitchen, her tone cold. "I told you to stop harassing that man." Roy glared at her but said nothing. Deep down, he knew she was right. Meanwhile, at the local police station, Chief Rick Daniels faced a storm of his own. The footage of Roy's behavior had reached the department's higher-ups, and Rick had spent the morning fielding calls from angry city officials and community leaders. Each call carried the same message: fix this or face the consequences. Rick sighed heavily, staring at Roy's badge and gun on his desk. He knew this wasn't just about one rogue officer. This was a reckoning for the entire precinct. At noon, Jonathan finally stepped outside. The reporters, still waiting, rushed toward him, microphones raised and cameras rolling. "Mr. Carter, can you comment on the incident with Officer Anderson?" one asked. "Do you think this reflects systemic racism in the police force?" Another chimed in. Jonathan held up a hand, signaling for quiet. "I'll say this," he began, his voice steady but firm. "What happened yesterday was unacceptable. No one should have to face harassment or threats, especially not from those sworn to protect us. This isn't just about me. It's about accountability, about ensuring that power isn't abused." His words were measured, but they carried weight. The reporters jotted down every syllable, and within minutes, his statement was trending online. That evening, Jonathan received an unexpected visitor. Rick Daniels stood on his porch, looking tired but resolute. "May I come in?" Rick asked. Jonathan nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. They sat in the living room, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. "I came to apologize," Rick began, "for Roy's actions, for the embarrassment this has caused, and for the harm it's done to our community. It shouldn't have taken this incident to open our eyes, but it has." Jonathan studied him for a moment before replying. "Apologies are a start, Rick, but they're not enough. What happens next will define whether this department can regain the community's trust." Rick nodded. "We've already launched an internal review. Roy will face disciplinary action, and we're implementing mandatory training on bias and de-escalation. It's not a solution, but it's a step." Jonathan leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I hope you mean that, Rick, because this isn't just about fixing one department, it's about setting a standard for others to follow." As the two men shook hands, a quiet understanding passed between them. They both knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to take it. Roy Anderson sat in the small, dimly lit hearing room, his palms clammy and heart-pounding. The weight of the past few days bore down on him like an anchor. Across the table sat a panel of stern-faced officers, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. At the head of the table was Chief Rick Daniels, his face unreadable, but his eyes sharp as knives. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Roy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mind replaying the events that had brought him here. Every insult he hurled, every smug step he took toward Jonathan Carter's property, and, most damningly, the moment he had drawn his gun. He had tried to justify it to himself, but deep down he knew the truth. His actions weren't about protecting the neighborhood. They were about his ego. "Officer Anderson," Chief Daniels began, his voice cold and measured, "you've been brought here today to answer for your actions. Do you have anything to say for yourself before we proceed?" Roy hesitated, glancing at the other officers in the room. He knew there was no point in lying. The security footage had captured everything. Still, his pride wouldn't let him fully admit guilt. "I didn't mean for things to go so far," Roy mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was protecting the neighborhood." Rick's gaze hardened. "Protecting the neighborhood?" he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. "By pointing a gun at an unarmed man? By threatening someone in their own home? That's not protection. That's abuse of power." The words hit Roy like a punch to the gut. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't. The evidence was stacked too high against him. As the hearing continued, the panel laid out the charges against Roy: misconduct, abuse of authority, racial bias, and endangering a civilian's life. Each accusation felt like a nail in the coffin of his career. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, a crowd had gathered. Protesters held signs that read, "Justice for Jonathan," and "End police brutality." Their chants echoed through the streets, a stark reminder that this wasn't just about one man's actions. It was about the systemic issues they represented. Back in the hearing room, Rick Daniels leaned forward, his voice firm but quieter now. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done, Roy? This isn't just about losing your job. Your actions have damaged the trust between this department and the community. That's not something we can easily repair." Roy's head dropped, shame washing over him. He thought about his wife's cold silence, the stares he received at the grocery store, and the isolation he felt from his fellow officers. He had always believed he was untouchable, but now he saw how wrong he had been. I, I messed up," Roy admitted, his voice breaking. "I didn't think. I just acted. And now I've ruined everything." Rick nodded slowly. "Acknowledging your mistakes is a start, but it doesn't erase the harm you've caused. The question now is whether you're willing to take responsibility and face the consequences." As the panel deliberated, Roy sat in silence, his thoughts racing. He knew he was about to lose his badge, but what scared him more was the realization that he had become everything he once swore to fight against. Finally, Rick spoke again. "Officer Anderson, effective immediately, you are terminated from the police force. Furthermore, the evidence against you will be forwarded to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. You'll have the right to legal representation. But let me be clear, this department will not shield you from accountability." Roy's heart sank. The room spun as the reality of his situation hit him like a tidal wave. His career, his reputation, his life as he knew it was all gone. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers as news of Roy's termination spread. Jonathan Carter, standing near the edge of the crowd, watched silently. He didn't feel joy or satisfaction, just a quiet resolve. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. As Roy was escorted out of the precinct, the protesters' chants grew louder. "No justice! No peace!" they shouted, their voices a powerful reminder that the fight for accountability was far from over. Jonathan, now joined by Chief Daniels, addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about one man's actions," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. "It's about ensuring that no one, officer or civilian, is above the law. Change starts here, and it starts with all of us." As the sun set on the tense day, Roy sat alone in his car, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He didn't recognize the man looking back at him. For the first time, he wondered if he could ever redeem himself, or if it was too late. The days following Roy Anderson's dismissal brought a strange calm to the neighborhood. The protesters dispersed, and the street that had once been filled with shouts and signs now lay quiet under the early morning sun. But for Jonathan Carter, the silence was just the beginning of something louder, a conversation that the community desperately needed. Sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, Jonathan stared at the empty street. It was hard to shake the events of the past week. He had spent his entire career navigating dangerous situations. But this felt different. It was personal. Still, he wasn't someone who dwelled on anger. He believed in action and in turning pain into progress. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Opening it, he found Mrs. Jane Porter, an older neighbor who had kept her distance since he moved in. She held a casserole dish in her hands, her face hesitant but kind. "I wanted to apologize," Jane began, her voice trembling slightly, "for not stepping up when I saw what was happening. It wasn't right, and I'm sorry." Jonathan studied her for a moment, sensing the sincerity in her words. He offered a small smile and stepped aside. "Come in, Mrs. Porter. Let's talk." They sat in the living room, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Jane explained how she had grown up in a time when speaking out felt dangerous, and how that fear had followed her into adulthood. "But after seeing what you went through," she said, her voice steady now, "I realize silence is just as harmful. I want to do better." Her visit set off a ripple effect. Over the next few days, other neighbors began reaching out, some with apologies, others with offers of support. A group of residents approached Jonathan with an idea, a community meeting to address what had happened and discuss how they could prevent it from happening again. Jonathan agreed, but he had one condition. "This isn't about pointing fingers," he told them. "It's about understanding each other and finding a way forward." The meeting was held in the local church hall. It was packed with residents, reporters, and even a few officers from the precinct. Chief Rick Daniels sat in the front row, his presence a reminder that the police weren't exempt from the conversation. Jonathan stood at the podium, his tall frame commanding attention. He spoke with a calm authority that silenced the room. What happened to me isn't just my story, he began. It's the story of countless others who've been judged, mistreated, and silenced because of the color of their skin. But this isn't about blame, it's about change. He shared his vision for a neighborhood where diversity wasn't just tolerated, but celebrated. We have a chance to set an example, he said, to show that when we listen to each other, when we acknowledge our biases and work to overcome them, we all grow stronger. The room erupted in applause, but Jonathan wasn't finished. He turned to Rick Daniels. Chief, we need more than words. We need action. I propose we work together to create training programs for your officers, programs that focus on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and community engagement. Rick stood, his expression serious. Mr. Carter, you have my word. We'll work on this together. The meeting ended with a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. People lingered, talking to neighbors they had never spoken to, sharing stories and exchanging ideas. For Jonathan, the real victory came a week later when he saw Mrs. Porter sitting on her porch with a young black couple who had just moved in down the street. They were laughing together, the tension that had once defined the neighborhood replaced by something softer, something better. Weeks turned into months, and the echoes of that fateful confrontation still lingered in the community. But what started as an incident of hate had blossomed into something remarkable: hope. Jonathan Carter, with his calm resilience and unwavering sense of justice, had turned a painful moment into a spark for real change. The newly formed community council, initiated by Jonathan and supported by Chief Rick Daniels, began meeting weekly. Residents of all backgrounds came together, discussing ways to make their neighborhood inclusive and welcoming. They developed programs to foster understanding, like cultural awareness workshops and mentorships for at-risk youth. Jonathan, however, didn't stop there. Using his influence and connections, he worked with Rick to implement new training for police officers across the city. The initiative focused on de-escalation techniques, unconscious bias training, and ways to build trust within diverse communities. Officers were required to attend community events, not as enforcers but as neighbors. One sunny afternoon, the first of these events took place in the local park. Children played on the swings, their laughter mingling with the chatter of adults. Food trucks lined the street, serving everything from soul food to tacos, and a local band played upbeat tunes that had even the older folks tapping their feet. Jonathan stood in the middle of it all, watching the transformation with quiet pride. He spotted Henry, a teenager who had been inspired by the events to pursue a career in law enforcement. Mr. Carter, Henry said, approaching him with a wide grin, I applied to the academy. I want to be the kind of officer that makes people feel safe, like you did for us. Jonathan's chest swelled with emotion. That's the kind of change we need, Henry. I'm proud of you. The ripple effect spread beyond the neighborhood. The video of Roy Anderson's misconduct and the subsequent reforms had gone viral, sparking conversations about policing and accountability across the nation. Jonathan was invited to speak at conferences and panels, sharing his experience and advocating for systemic change. In one such interview, he said, "What happened to me isn't unique. It's a reality for too many people. But if we're willing to confront our biases and work together, we can create a society where everyone feels like they belong." Back in the neighborhood, a small but powerful gesture cemented Jonathan's legacy. The local park, once a symbol of division, was renamed Carter's Unity Park. A plaque at the entrance read, "Dedicated to Jonathan Carter, whose courage reminded us all that change begins at home." The park's dedication ceremony brought out the entire community. Mrs. Porter, who had once been wary of Jonathan, gave a heartfelt speech about how he had opened her eyes. "He didn't just change the neighborhood," she said. "He changed me." Even Chief Daniels, who had initially been defensive about the incident, stood proudly beside Jonathan. "Sometimes it takes a good man to remind us of what we stand for," he said. As the ceremony ended, Jonathan found himself standing in the middle of the park, watching children play and neighbors laugh together. A young girl tugged at his sleeve, holding out a piece of paper. "What's this?" he asked, crouching down to her level. "It's a picture of you," she said shyly. The drawing showed Jonathan standing tall, with a big smile, surrounded by stick-figure people holding hands. Jonathan chuckled, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. It's perfect." As the sun set that evening, Jonathan sat on his porch, sipping tea and reflecting on everything that had happened. The fight against prejudice wasn't over, but this small corner of the world was proof that change was possible. In the distance, children's laughter echoed through Carter's Unity Park, a sound that carried with it the promise of a brighter future. For Jonathan, that was more than enough.